It's time. It's episode 66. It's a brand new year, 2024. I welcome back my good mate, Mark Watson. Happy New Year, mate.
Yeah, Happy New Year to you, Martin. It's hard to believe, isn't it? 66 episodes? We've been doing this for, about a year and a half now?
Yeah, and, I look forward to this so much every Tuesday because we chew the fat about all kinds of sport. We get the long handle out and we take it to it, and we don't actually sit there and mollycoddle anybody. I want to get stuck into Cam Norrie and Daniel Altmaier, who I think are a couple of frauds.
Apologise to me!
First, let's kick it with Sky TV, who just before Christmas again increased our prices. And then you look at things like the coverage of the ASB Classic, where they refuse to put local commentators in, so they take the English guys who absolutely butchered the Pōwhiri and Ngāti Whātua and all the language and stuff like that. Then when it comes to the doubles, and I know this for a fact, they did it off-site. They didn't even set up a studio at Stanley Street at all. They had guys sitting there in Mount Wellington calling it. So they're putting up our prices. At the same time, they're obviously seriously cutting their own costs. You've got Netball New Zealand who are now sitting there fretting, wondering what kind of deal they're going to get offered over the ANZ Premiership, because rumours are that Sky are going to go back to them and say that it's only worth half the money. It's not making any money. And yet on the opposite side of that, here they are promoting the hell out of women's rugby. I know it's an old chestnut we keep beating, but I'm just looking at it purely from an economic model here, Mark. Women's rugby makes no money. Women's rugby will not make any money for a very long time. Women's rugby costs so much money, yet you're not allowed to talk about that. Yet they're prepared to hammer netball, which is still the preeminent, most major women's sport in the country. This has not got the publicity it deserves.
No, look, they're wanting to sell a business, clearly. So what they're wanting to try and do is maximise the sale of Sky. They've already tried once, turn the whatever offer down from whatever partner or potential buyer was interested. That was never disclosed publicly. So what they're doing here is they're just continually reducing costs. I've spoken to camera people who have said that even production values at games like rugby, they've gone from 8 cameras to 6 cameras, and they're reducing the general production qualities. They're using sort of contractors to come in, companies that historically have been sort of more involved in live streaming. So not quite the full sort of outdoor production trucks that you expect. So what they're basically doing is reducing costs at every level, increasing prices, and trying to create a false economy. So they'll increase their profits. And that's just really to try and sell this business for more than it's actually worth. It's a business that's around transaction. There's nothing invitational about it now as the consumer. And so that's really the reason for it. It's skullduggery. It's just so morally corrupt. And if you're a shareholder, you've got to be overly concerned. They're trying to make out that they're still relevant, but really, I think they're in a world of trouble here. I don't think it's an organisation that's particularly well led. I think, as we've said, and I think it's been highlighted, that I think there has been a lot of identity politics, which I think have been more important to those running this organisation than actually thinking about the shareholders, actually thinking about the consumer. Look, I can understand. Look, I'm probably in agreement. I think you could get rid of netball, and I don't think Sky would be affected at all. I genuinely say that. I still think Sky is predominantly a male platform, and I still think that most people that purchase Sky are predominantly the males in the house. However, netball is still relevant, and you still got to have local content. Is it worth what it once was? Probably not. And that's now an issue that netball have to face. And this is just the harsh reality of women's sport and sport in general. You can jump up and down, you can look at models overseas, but it's still got to make economic sense. And you can play the political game, and you can go down, and you can talk about oppression over the years, and and make all the excuses for why women's sport is not the economic model that perhaps some men's sport is. But the reality is people just aren't watching it like they did, and you can apply the same to a lot of men's sport. But it is a tough one when you see them still continuing to invest and show women's rugby. The only reason they're doing it is clearly it must be a contractual obligation with the deal they've done with New Zealand Rugby. When they signed that deal, they must have a contractual obligation. I guarantee if they could get out of it, they would, because the production costs of running any live sport are significant. You're talking a minimum of $25,000, probably more around $50,000 a game. Now, no one is watching it. You know that, and I know that as well. So, yeah, look, I think Sky are being very disingenuous at the moment. It's all about trying to sell this business. It's all about trying to inflate the value of it. And you do that by increasing the costs, increasing the price to the consumer, reducing the costs around the business, and creating a little bit of a false economy in the short term. But whoever ends up buying this business, a lot of damage is done in the long term, Martin.
You know, in terms of the way that they are covering sports at the moment, at Sky TV, it's this thing where they're refusing to send people to grounds. I mean, this is as disingenuous as it gets, isn't it, Mark? The whole point of live sport is that you have to have people at these venues because that's where you imbibe, you get the atmosphere. It creates a different broadcasting experience as much as it creates a different spectator experience.
I agree, Martin, and what they did with the tennis is, again, just another part of this cost cutting. This is about reducing costs because they want to sell the business. So, if you're not spending money, that's more money on the profit line. But again, you end up losing it. Look, I've recently, last year, did quite a bit of commentary remotely. So I was actually commentating events in Europe, and I was doing it from my living room at home, and I struggled as a commentator. I just never felt like I was there, never felt like I was really in the moment, never really felt the atmosphere, and I think that probably came through maybe in my commentary as well. And it's not like we're having to send a large crew to Australia to cover this. It's at ASB, it's at Stanley Street in Auckland, it's a 20-minute drive from the Sky studios, but they're clearly calling it off tube. And then they got, and because of cost cutting originally and bringing in English commentators from overseas to do it, they got themselves into trouble, didn't they, when it came to Māori protocol and pronunciation, and then suddenly they sort of were running for cover. And that's always the risk when you start cutting costs. You get what you sort of pay for a little bit. But it's interesting, isn't it? But we'll still turn up to rugby and we'll have a cast of 10,000 pre-game commentators and different hosts all trying to tell us everything that we already know, half an hour build up to try and sell more advertising revenue. And look, I'll say this, I've had some experiences with Sky in recent times. I think the whole organisation is just incredibly poorly run. I think the governance is poor. And they're just fortunate that they've got a monopoly, because they would not survive in a competitive marketplace under their current leadership and under their current vision. And you've got to start actually thinking about the consumer again, and actually start thinking about the fan and start thinking about us. Because as I've said in the past, Sky is no longer the default setting at night. For most people I talk to, there's very little stuff on there that's actually appointment viewing. They continue to invest heavily in a product that nobody's interested in. I think they've been complicit in part of that and taking the interest out of rugby, because as you know and I know, yes, they have these TV programs, but it's fluff. Nothing's ever said. There's no discussion ever generated. There's nothing actually engaging about anything they do. They're just more interested in putting press releases out about, hey, look, we've got 29 women fronting TV shows this week. Now, I've got no problem with that if they're the right people. That should not be the focus. Focus on the quality, focus on the content, focus on the consumer, and put your political issues and your personal values to one side and actually start running this organisation commercially and responsibly.
Apologise to me!
Let's talk about rugby in a second, because here we are at the start of the year, and I was talking to Sean a little bit earlier and saying that, I don't miss it. I don't miss it. And I'm excited about the NRL coming up, but I'm just not that excited about Super Rugby. I'm looking forward to the All Blacks season, but this is what they've done. And Mark Robinson talks about fan-centric and fan engagement. I'm not seeing any of it, but let's park that for a second as we talk about Zoe Hobbs. The Halbergs are all out. Why wasn't she given her props with these awards?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because she wasn't even nominated. Now, I think that must go back to Athletics New Zealand, but did she ever fill a criteria? Now, it's an interesting one because what did Zoe Hobbs win? She actually won nothing. Okay, if you look at it in pure black and white, she's not a World Championship medalist, not even a Commonwealth Games medalist, but she, if you go through the history of sprinting and you go from Sally Pearce and Catherine Freeman in Australia, go back to Raylene Boyle. No athlete ever out of New Zealand, Australia, or Oceania has ever broken 11 seconds for the 100 metres. Zoe Hobbs does that, okay? And that is a remarkable achievement. You go back through the history of both countries, how many people have walked the surface of Australia over the last 200, or going right back through the Aboriginal times, and the same with Māori and colonisation. No person in history has ever run quicker than Zoe Hobbs, yet she can't get a nomination. She can't be part of the discussion. And we've got to have some scope here to be able to look a little bit broader and somehow be able to take situations like Zoe and try and put them into context and give her the recognition and give her the nomination. And I think Stephen Adams falls into this too. I think Chris Wood falls into this. How do you measure the achievements of Stephen Adams? The fact that he's getting paid $25 million a year says that this guy is extraordinary, that he is the elite of the elite. He is 0.00001% of the sporting world in terms of what he's achieved. Chris Wood scoring a hat-trick against Newcastle United, playing for Nottingham Forest. How do we measure that, say, against Kane Williamson, who gets 10 opportunities a year and goes out and maybe scores 300 in a test and therefore gets a nomination, or Ross Taylor ends up the leading run scorer for the year, or the netballer that shoots 90% throughout an entire season? How do we quantify the achievements of the Zoe Hobbs in a sport that is truly global, arguably every 4 years the pinnacle event when it comes to women's sport, the women's 100 metres at the Olympics? How do we quantify that? How do we quantify the Stephen Adams and the Chris Woods? And I think that's an area of contention for me. It's a bit of a minefield because their achievements are not just black and white. There are just some sports, some events that just carry that much more weight than others. I cannot believe for one moment winning a World Bowls Championship surpasses the achievements of what Zoe Hobbs did in 2023. That's just my opinion on it, Martin.
Yeah, I don't have any argument with that, mate. And I also think that the Warriors should win Team of the Year. Look, and again, I mean, I know it's, how do you actually quantify what they achieved, given the fact that they didn't actually win anything? But, when you're looking at them versus the New Zealand seven sides, men's and women's, look, if you went around and asked most sports fans in this country, hey, what did the Warriors do last year? I guarantee every single person, bar none, would be able to tell you. If I went around and asked those same people, hey, what did the men's seven side do? Nobody would have a clue, mate. Nobody even knows what the circuit is or who's playing or when they're playing, and yet these teams get nominated. All right, let us end on rugby. Have you missed it at all?
No, not at all, mate. In fact, I'm just a little bit... I'll be honest, mate. I got annoyed this morning when you sent me a text saying that you wanted to talk about rugby. I was like, come on, Martin, are we going to be talking about rugby again already? Come on, man.
It's a national bloody game, mate. Come on.
Let's just put this to bed. You know what's going to happen. The Blues are going to come up slightly short.
Yes.
The only interest is going to be how the Crusaders are going to go without Scott Robertson under a new coaching regime. The Chiefs will be in the mix. The Hurricanes, the Australians will be woeful. We'll look forward to a couple of derby games. We'll have players who will excel at Super Rugby, who you think should be All Blacks, will get to All Black level and be absolutely damn ordinary because they're just not used to the physicality and the closeness and the gladiatorial nature that the North and South Africa sort of throw at us at an international level. I'm already bored, Martin. And then I'll tune onto Sky TV and we'll have the breakdown and they'll tell us nothing and they'll just... continue to be a PR firm for rugby. The crowds will continue to diminish, and then New Zealand Rugby will put out the press release telling us how the level of social media engagement has gone through the roof, and it's the highest it's ever been. And and then we as radio hosts will put requests into the Super Rugby franchises to get players on, but they won't be able to put anybody up because they're training or they're having a day off, or how dare you inconvenience me, sort of walking around and acting like they're Liverpool or Chelsea Football Club, and somehow they've got sort of this global obligation, and who are you, some sort of small time New Zealand media outfit? Meanwhile, when people do turn up to these venues around the ground, they'll be charged $20 for a bloody hot dog and a gourmet hamburger that if you actually happen to drop will bounce straight back because it's that rubbery, Martin. I've pretty much summed up the rugby season, haven't I?
Devlin.
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
The platform.